Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the fourth in our series of Lockdown, Light at the End of the Tunnel. And this is one of, I think, our most important in the series, and it's about mental health and mental health in the workplace. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and very, very big thank you to Paula Dixon, who is going to be walking us through all this today. And we've made sure we have plenty of time, so it's an hour and a half. I know everyone wants to go outside in the sunshine, but it probably will still be there and feel better once you've gone through all this. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Paula so you can introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi there, everybody. So thank you very much for having me along today, Heather. My name's Paula Louise Dixon, and I'm a business psychologist representing Serenity today. So in terms of my background as a business psychologist, I work with executives, teams, and within the recruitment sector. But I also specialise in executive coaching, leadership coaching, and work with neurodiverse individuals as well. So thank you very much for having me along today.
Excellent.
Next
Excellent.
slide, please.
This just tells us who we are. So
yeah, I think we know.
how to get in touch with us if you need. Which I should say that there is a handout with this. So if anyone is on watching this either live or on demand, there should be a button where you can download the handout, and it will have contact details, and it will have more detailed information about some of the things that Paula's going to be talking about throughout, including some links to some very important resources. So make sure you do that. Also, as we go through this, if you feel there's something we may or may not cover, or if you want more details about something, you want to ask a question, please feel free to ask that question in the question or chat field, and we will cover those questions at the end. Okay, so feel free to do them throughout, to ask them throughout, and we will then ask them at the end, and we'll also prompt you to do that at some point as well. Okay, so why don't we go on to the next slide? This is what we're doing today, right?
Absolutely. So time to explore what it means in terms of mental health and adjusting to the new normal that we're all faced with today. So we're going to have a little look. If we move on to the next slide, it'll give us an overview of some of the topics we're going to explore.
Perfect. Right.
Okay. So in terms of this reality that we're now facing as a result of COVID-19, we're going to think about it from a number of different perspectives. We're going to start off with looking at things at an organisational level, because obviously broad considerations are important for people returning to the workplace environment at all levels. We're going to have a little look around what leaders can do. And when we talk about leaders, we'll be thinking about individuals both from their role as an employee, but also in the role of managing others. And a big focus today will be thinking about practical takeaways. So I encourage you as we go through today to maybe think about what's that one small thing you can do as a leader in your practice to really support the mental health of the team around you. We'll also look at the neuropsychology. So in other words, what's going on for us at a personal level when we're faced with stress, because I think often understanding what's going on really helps us to make sense. And we'll move into some employee considerations. Again, the practical focus, thinking from your point of view, what can I do differently? What can I do to support my mental health in the workplace? And we'll also look at neurodiversity, the impact that the new normal has on individuals and colleagues who are neurodiverse.
Excellent. Well, if we go to the first slide, in this, I think it tells us a little bit about where we were before this happened. So tell us what the world of mental health and mental health at work looked like before we even went into lockdown.
Absolutely. So for those of you that haven't heard this term before, VUCA refers to a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. It's a military term, but actually it's been used increasingly over the last few years to describe the working environment that we're all faced with. In essence, it describes really unprecedented shifts, such as the use of technology, that's led to us feeling like we're in a culture that's always on, that blurring of boundaries between the work and the home life and the impact that that's had on us. And as a result of that, actually working in that stressful environment has actually meant that we have reduced opportunity for renewing ourselves, and kind of the output of that generally is a lot more stress that people have been feeling anyway. Can we move on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, because you've got some good stats on this.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is to think about really the reality that we've been faced with in the UK in relation to mental health. So the Office of National Statistics, their latest survey in 2018-19, talked about the volume of time that's been taken off, the loss of 17.5 million working days. And as a result of that, the 44% of those cases has actually been resultant of stress, anxiety, depression. And actually that was before COVID-19. So it's thinking about the impact of that environment and you know, what people have been operating within anyway before COVID happened itself.
Okay, well then let's take a look at what we can do with that. What are we seeing now?
Yep, so compounding that, as people start to think about returning perhaps from furlough or coming back into the work environment, there are increased kind of practical issues and really sort of important issues around financial security, job security. There's been, certainly in the people that I've been coaching throughout this, there's been that kind of sharing really about people working longer hours, irregular hours, the need to fit things around for those that have got additional caring responsibilities, be that sort of children or elderly parents perhaps. And people have reported a lot about this creep. It was happening anyway because of the technology, but it's maybe exacerbated it a little bit. And as a result of that, the impact on people's mental health, you know, what are people feeling? People are quite anxious, uncertain. We've not faced this before, so there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going on.
And we do have some on the opposite end of the spectrum of not working more hours, but not working any hours and not sure what's going to happen. Are they going to have a job on the other side of this? So
Absolutely.
anxiety on both ends.
Absolutely, yeah. And some of the suggestions that we'll have later on are applicable if you find yourself at either end of that spectrum. So yeah, absolutely, they'll be helpful for you.
Excellent. Well, let's start with some organizational considerations.
Yeah, so what we would recommend, I mean, before we go back at an organisational level, it's really key to have a great mental health policy in place. You know, that's a given. You've got to have a great one. So is this the time to maybe think about reviewing that, making sure that as part of that, you've got some really clear signposting to the support that's available. So in other words, occupational health, employee assistance programs, because if individuals are going to be experiencing increased levels of mental ill health, are you clear about who you're going to send them to that further support for? How might you help them? ACAS as a website has got some great information practically and the legalities, and mental health providers and charities can be really, really useful, such as Mind. As part of that risk assessment, you would expect that upon people returning to the work environment, actually HR and perhaps managers have gone through and really assessed the environment that people will be returning to. So having, as part of that, a triage plan. If somebody presents and is really in crisis, how are you going to best support that individual to manage that? In addition, and I think this is probably one of the things that a lot of people don't know, in terms of the Equality Act, mental health is considered as being something that falls under that umbrella. And, you know, if somebody is experiencing anxiety or challenge, this type of environment might exacerbate it and really kind of ramp up those feelings. So really thinking about your responsibility as an organisation or a leader, how best to support those individuals, because actually a mental health condition might not be visible every day, but you still have that responsibility of care to maybe make a reasonable adjustment. And so the reasonable adjustments that we talk about that could be suitable for people are things like a change in hours, location, the duties, or maybe the equipment. But actually another type of support, and this is the kind of support that I often get involved in, is as a result of having an access to work assessment. So this is part of a government support package that individuals, employers can access, and an assessment's made of which actually support can be given in the form of coaching that supports that individual on the job. Another side of that as well is a wellness action plan. This is advocated by Mind. And a wellness action plan really talks about, it doesn't need to be creative for somebody if they're actually in crisis. Every employee could have one. And it talks in more detail about the things that that individual might need to think about and reflect on for them to manage their mental health well. So, you know, there are links in the handout actually for all of these things. We do encourage you to go and have a look and see what resources are available.
Yes, good reminder.
And finally,
I was going to say that, sorry.
Sure. And then finally, just the impact of culture in terms of the need to model and be as sort of reflect what it is that you're saying. and the need to effectively be that role model for an organisation. But I've got another slide that will talk about that in a moment.
Yes, yes, and we were going to go into more details on that too. And just as a reminder, there are some really important links here, like the access to work, the fact that a lot of these things that you're talking about, that there is government support and reimbursement for expenses related to access to work for mental health issues, accommodations for mental health issues.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think a lot of people who don't know that and aren't aware of that. So it's really important for employers to know that they have that help to help their employees.
Absolutely, yeah. And
So
using it, actually, interestingly, using it for that reason is one of the most underused, and people don't often actually take that step. So yeah, absolutely, it's available.
well, I think part of the problem is we just don't know about it as an employer. I think just talking to you in preparation for this was the first time I'd heard about that as well. So it's not
Sure.
well known. So hopefully this will make a lot of people aware of that, and that link is in the handout. So make sure that people download that. Okay, next slide then. Let's talk about what leaders and managers should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing that we think about is that role model behaviour. The impact of how senior leaders behave has a massive impact in terms of how followers, how engaged they are. And actually, the idea of thinking about self-care from that point of view of oxygen masks, when you're on a flight, the suggestion is put your oxygen mask on first, and there's a reason for that. And it's rather challenging, isn't it? If we're asking you to look after your workforce or your direct reports, then obviously you need to have somebody that is well themselves. So this works for both people. It's that idea of prioritising self-care. And what we've found in terms of acknowledging and sharing feelings is that those leaders that are able to express reasonably and with proportion, so in other words, those leaders that are not going through crisis themselves, but feel comfortable to talk about maybe increased levels of frustration or anger as a result of the situation that they're facing, those leaders are able to build connection. And it's really helpful for individuals to feel that that normalises their experience at work. It makes them feel that we're all in it together. It's not something that's just happening to them. And part of that normalisation is really helpful for people to think about taking action rather than maybe hiding some of the worry and the feeling that they've got.
Yeah,
certainly in relation. Sorry, go on, Heather. Yeah.
I think again, as an employer, I think that's really important to note, because I think a lot of people in leadership positions think they have to model that everything is fine, everything is perfect, and they've never had a problem in their life, and the way they got there is because they've never suffered any anxiety or depression or anything. When the truth is, I would say managers and leaders right now are going through an excessive amount of anxiety and stress themselves, and being able to communicate how we've experienced that and gotten through it, and being able to show some empathy in that way is actually going to help our workforces better. And so role modeling, as you said, as well as taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of if we have that language, we can reduce that self-blame. We can stop thinking it's just me that feels that way, and we can think about, in terms of the standards that we set for ourselves, that honesty and that just dialogue can really stop people sort of having those really unrealistic expectations for themselves, which of course is what we want when people are starting to think about returning to the workplace. So the other side of that, I guess, is that if people do share, if they're in a crisis, or they're experiencing increased levels of mental ill health, or even just not feeling quite right, if somebody chooses to share that with their line manager, that whole validation piece, that if it's quite exposing, isn't it, to talk about mental health openly. So if you are somebody that shared something, certainly from an individual that I coach, they talked about regretting afterwards, or slightly being worried about, once it had been out there, how would they be perceived? And that idea of validating, going back to that individual and kind of acknowledging what they said and thanking them and reassuring them that they're not going to lose the job as a result, and actually that their opinion is still valid and is still welcome, is really important for kind of letting people relax and boosting that ability to talk about mental well-being in the workplace. I think that reassurance really sort of helps people to calm down. And in terms of recognition, one of the things to say, we talk here is about, it could be a subtle change. You know, if you've got that relationship with individual employees, often it can be something as subtle as maybe that person does appear a little bit more frustrated or angry or irritable. It might not necessarily be a massive change. It could be things around eating habits, you know, really subtle things, withdrawing more or less, you know, being unwilling to sort of engage, that kind of thing. So being able to recognize these things really helps, because actually if you've got that relationship and you know, maybe you're spending a little bit more time as people return checking in and just spending a lot more time understanding what's going on in terms of people's experiences, what you can do as a leader then is actually intervene more quickly. And what the research supports is that actually if you've got that open dialogue and you can intervene at an earlier point, the outcomes are better for people because they feel more able to share, they feel more able to put practical things in place. And as a leader, you know, setting some of those boundaries perhaps, certainly in terms of, you know, this available 24/7 culture. I don't know what you're like, but I certainly know of individuals that are, you know, that I'm working with that are talking about being available from 7 o'clock in the morning to midnight. And when they're receiving those messages, either via WhatsApp or email, they're slightly worried about being perceived as lazy or not committed or something like that. So actually, as a leader, articulating those boundaries, not being available all the time, just explaining that if somebody's taking a day off, they won't be checking emails, you know, really reinforcing those kind of healthy boundaries.
Yeah, and it's something
Sounds
I've
a good start.
as a leader, I've had to do myself to try and set, because when you run your own business, when you're always sort of in charge, you feel like you always have to be working, you always have to be doing this, and sometimes
Absolutely, yeah,
you
yeah.
don't insist on, okay, I'm going to stop working at this time. I'm not going to work on a Saturday this week or next week. That I do
Yeah.
sit as modeling for our own employees. We need to do that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, I've seen examples such as, you know, people putting in their email footer the core hours that they work and just kind of saying, you know, I may send an email to you, but that's because it suits me, not because I'm expecting you to pick it up. And just really simple practical strategies help to create just a bit more acceptance or a few boundaries around what that looks like as an experience. Moving on a little bit in terms of if things are getting on top of people and, you know, an individual's identified that, there is the opportunity for a line manager when they're intervening to maybe try and provide a bit of air cover and just help that individual just in the short term, you know, to work flexibly or come up with a slightly different plan. And I think one of the most powerful things that a leader can do in supporting direct reports is thinking about that reframing piece. If you notice somebody's language has changed, you know, they're starting to be a little bit more negative, helping that individual to maybe focus away from the volume of stuff or, you know, all the things that they're worried about. Maybe we're just bringing it quite back and thinking, you know, what one thing am I going to focus on today? And just kind of really sort of setting those expectations much smaller, because I know from personal experience, when you've got a lot on you, sometimes you don't know where to focus. So it can be really helpful to manage. The next part to support that as well, I like this idea of transition truth. It's a good piece of research, but the idea is that essentially, you know, we're all going through this experience. Yeah. We've certainly not been through it before quite in this way. And as a result of that, this is going to take time. You know, we all need to manage our own expectations because we've not done this before. And as a result of that unpredictability, there's going to be an emotional component, and that can fluctuate. You know, how we feel fluctuates massively, doesn't it? So just kind of having that expectation and understanding that, and certainly as a leader, understanding that your team might be different on different days, and having that in your mind as a starting point, I think frees people to maybe not be quite stressed trying to control everything and sort of hold on to everything. And the next one, we'll look at a picture in a moment, but focusing on change. Mm-hmm. I don't know about your experience of change, Heather, but I think, you know, what we often notice is that, oh, go on, yeah.
I just my life has been a series of drastic changes, and so I've almost had like a boot camp on many levels. So, but it does take training. It does take recognizing, because I've had to train myself to recognize when because usually I think, oh, I'm so used to massive changes that this is going to be easy for me.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then I have to step back and recognize when actually the changes is I'm not handling the change as well as I thought I was handling it.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that what the graph you have up next
Yeah.
and what you're talking about is really important for us to recognize that this is change, that this is important, and to see where we are on that change.
Yeah, that takes me really nicely. Yeah, so if we can move on to the next slide and we'll have a little look at the change curve.
And I think I was telling people, I think this is the origin of it, but a lot of people think of this in more terms of the 7 stages of grief. It's
Absolutely.
essentially the same. It's the same curve. It's just this is the foundation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw a really interesting webinar recently that talked about, you know, because of these unprecedented times, we're going through a growth curve, a learning curve, and a change curve. So again, you know, talking about that realistic expectation. But I think what's helpful with this tool is something that actually you could use in a conversation with a colleague and with a direct report. Because as you quite rightly say, you know, we may have experienced change before, but change isn't linear. And certainly as people move through this, you know, at the start of the crisis, shock and denial is very common. And as we move through it, we might experience, you know, low emotions. And eventually over time, as we adjust, we start to move out the other side of it. However, if you want to look at it as a way to manage or to help someone, you might notice, you know, some of the behaviours, maybe some of the frustrations, and having that conversation and inviting a direct report to answer these questions here, you know, reflect either personally or as a part of a conversation where you are, what you're feeling, and that invitation to talk about it. Now, the reason why that's helpful is that actually when we're in an emotional state, we know that we're not problem solving, we're not being very practical. But actually that invitation to step into a discussion to get somebody to reflect on where they are helps to move them into more of a problem solving, solution focused mindset. So that very invitation, you know, being able to talk about what's going on for you is reassuring. But actually when it's coupled with that problem solving mindset, that can help individuals to move towards being more solution focused at work. Helpful one, that one, definitely.
Very,
okay.
Very. Next.
Okay, so if we move on to the next one. So another piece, sorry, after you.
No, sorry, I just said we'd moved, we're on to the next one, sorry.
Okay, so some of the other research that's recently come out as well that's really, really helpful and useful is the type of leadership that you might want to think about using that's been shown to be very helpful in a COVID-19 state. Okay, so there are 3 particular types of behaviour, but this particular type of leadership is called servant leadership. So the 3 components that you're looking at there is a leader that empowers. So can you, as an individual, help your team or individual direct reports to think about how they can feel a sense of control? So we all know that job control is one as an experience at work is associated with a whole host of positive things, from better well-being, better mental health, and an increased level of satisfaction at work. And actually that involving, the other aspect of that, involving people in decision making, certainly if it affects them. Coming at it from the point of view, we know that, you know, you can't involve every employee in every part, but actually doing it in collaboration, if it involves somebody, helps to build a deeper sense of trust in that relationship. And certainly individuals are more likely, research supports, that they're going to accept some decisions maybe that they might not quite like or that aren't brilliant, if people feel that they've had access to information and they've been consulted as part of the process. We know that as part of change. And I think the third part of this is, you know, because if you are flexibly working, remote working, and maybe not seeing your colleagues as much as you did before, there's that element of collaboration, that idea that we're in it together. So the social isolation part of that, working together with others, can really help. And again, that builds trust. So sitting with that as well, in terms of the approach, one of the suggestions that you might want to think about is, are you somebody that's focused on the time and the hours that people put in? Can you shift your focus into an output perspective? So in other words, what does success look like? What would you like the individuals or the team members to really focus on and achieving? Because we know as we're adjusting and we're dealing with children and all the other things that happen when the postman and everything else that happens whilst you're at home, can you move to thinking about an output focus? This is an opportunity to do that. Also in terms of communication, so that idea of being clear, frequently communicating, and maybe before people start to come back to the workplace, asking them how they like to be communicated with. You know, some people prefer an email, some people might like to have the cameras on. I know I certainly work with a variety of people who have different preferences, so maybe tailoring the communication piece around individual needs can be really helpful. Doing things in that way actually helps people again to have that sense of control and maybe accept more. And it helps them to maybe accept, you know, you're sharing, we've not got a right answer. But in terms of your communication style, if you're coming at it from the point of view of, you know, how can I communicate and lift others? Thinking about how, when you approach it, you can get the best out of the people that you're speaking with, and maybe tailoring your style or your approach to do that. I certainly know a senior manager that's spending a lot of time at the moment, and a lot of their day is a schedule of calls for team members to check in, see what's going on, maybe talk about, you know, what they're expected to achieve by the end of the day in terms of what's a successful day look like for them, and just really keeping that relationship going. And explaining the rationale. Yeah.
Coming from the US, I can say that a lot of American companies do struggle with, larger companies especially, struggle, even if they're multinational and they have branches here. I've had people feeding back to me who work for US based companies over here that the communication is just not great. They don't know where there's a lot more anxiety because they're not being told as they go along. And also, for example, around the word furlough, which in the US is a common term, we know what it means. And it's generally, it's not a great thing, but we know that it's better than being laid off. It's better than being made redundant. It means that the company wants to bring you back, even if they can't afford to have you on full time right now. So it's generally considered a good middle ground. But since it's not a term that's used over here, and there's not that awareness of it, they don't talk about it with their staff and what it means. And I didn't realize that when I first moved. So I was talking about potential need to furlough, and but they're like, wait a minute, you can't just say that, because they don't understand. So once I was able to then communicate and explain what that meant, it was a little bit more calming. It's not like it's a great thing anyway, and it's not like it's a surety job is there, but it's at least understanding what that means.
Totally, because I think, you know, if we're in a highly charged, stressful environment, I think we all have a tendency, don't we, to kind of think the absolute worst. So if you're not sure about anything, I think we're far more, oh, what does, like you say, you know, that's the end of my contract or whatever. We're a lot more likely to go down that side of things. Totally.
Yeah.
Okay. So thinking now as well about this idea of job control. So in other words, people do better when their environment is rewarding. You know, we sort of run away from threats and we move towards rewards. So even if it is small decisions that we can make, or that you can foster as a leader, or even that you can make, you know, for yourself as a leader, that can really support that well-being piece. I can't stress that enough, you know, having some autonomy in the decisions that you make. So it might be something really small about how you schedule your day or what activities you're going to focus on. But I think this idea of, in terms of managing the stress and the anxiety, having that little bit of control can really help to ground people and make them feel a little bit more in control. Some of the positive coping as well that leaders can be really helpful with is just little things. What we tended to notice, and I certainly have heard people report this, is that, you know, our usual way of dealing with pressure is to do more, faster, longer. And actually that's not going to be sustainable over a long period of time, certainly not in terms of promoting good mental health. So recognizing that, you know, if people aren't taking breaks, no one can maintain a perfect concentration. But I think we've all been guilty. I know I certainly have, where you just kind of keep going, and then flop at the end of the day. So be mindful of how you as the leader could support smaller breaks, you know, maybe even taking a break to do some desk stretches, some yoga, using, you know, we've got lovely weather like this, just popping out into the garden, having a glass of water. All those things can be really, really helpful, because that allows people to refresh and get back into a concentrating mindset. And I think the other side of it is that actually helps boost resilience. You know, these resilient leaders, the research always shows they are a lot more productive, people view them really well, people want to work for a resilient leader. And it also is associated with high levels of engagement. So it's a very positive relationship in terms of productivity, but in terms of well-being as well. So as a leader, certainly in the handout that we've got, there are some questions that we've got there to kind of get you to think, you know, what could I change? What could I do differently? Because actually being more willing to change, we might not feel like it in these circumstances, but actually trying to open up and just think about, is there an opportunity to improve things here? And starting small is a really, really useful step in terms of boosting resilience. And this other idea of serving others, helping others, all that kind of positive behaviour, physiologically speaking, is associated with things like reduced blood pressure, lower levels of depression. So actually, you know, this applies to all employees really. If you can find opportunities to help colleagues as part of your day-to-day, really recommend that. And another thing to think about is your openness to diverse views. So if you're somebody, you know, who gets your source of information, questioning as a leader when you're making sense of an experience, who do you go to? Do you tend to have certain people that you go to, Heather, when you're making decisions?
Yes, I have. There are a list of people, and one of them in particular, I say, okay, we have a thing with each other where we say we need to process. I need to process something. Can you give me a minute? I need to process something, and we spend time. And they know that that means they may not even need to say anything. That I just need to talk something out, and likewise, they'll do the same. So understanding that just a sounding board. And so depending on what it is that I need, but that's a skill to learn, is to find those people. And to communicate with them what you're needing from them. So having almost code words, or you know, this is, I need to externally process this, or I need a sounding board that gives them a clue that this is what they're asking for right now. That's been very helpful, and it was a difficult one for me to do. That is one I had to learn to do, because it was, again, role modeling. I wasn't raised to ask for help, so it was something I trained myself to do, and I still have to occasionally remind myself to do.
Yeah, and I think, and to even extend it out further, you know, the invitation in terms of the resilience piece is actually thinking about, you know, do you take steps to incorporate diverse range of views when you are making decisions, and can you broaden it out even more just to make sure you've got a really representative viewpoint, I guess. And the final part of that, oh, sorry, go.
No, I was just saying it, absolutely. And you'd be surprised if you're needing somebody to talk to, you'd be surprised what people would be willing to do that with you, who may need to help somebody as part of their process, and say, okay, yeah, talk to me, because that will make me feel better, like I'm actually doing something to help. So I found that that's been really useful for me to recognize that this actually helps other people as well.
Yeah, great if you can get both sides of that coin going on there, definitely. And I think the other bit is about thinking about trustworthiness. That's the final component of this. So just thinking about, you know, in terms of your practice, now more than ever, being a trusted colleague, certainly in a leadership capacity, is really important. So the invitation here is to say, you know, do you sometimes overstretch? Do you make promises you can't keep? Because actually what we need to do is maintain those bonds and those connections in times of sort of uncertainty. So really, you know, that invitation is thinking at a personal level, maybe it's better to not offer too much and just kind of be really consistent, because that's what, you know, that's what direct employees are going to need at the moment. But on the top of that, which is great, is the other side of it, the recognition and reward. You know, in a digital world, the ability to communicate with many people is easier, isn't it? It's a touch of a button. So the positive side of it, because positive emotions are contagious, you know, happy people are known to be a lot more open to dialogue and willing to sort of have constructive conversations. If you have the opportunity to kind of really congratulate or acknowledge the good work that people are doing, can you actually do more of that and sort of tip that balance towards a more positive experience at work? Because actually we want those positive feelings as much as possible to come out, and that's a really simple way of doing it. And the last thing, another positive thing to think about in terms of these kind of unusual circumstances, is that it offers an opportunity to be creative. You know, have you got that opportunity? It might be really difficult, might be very uncertain, But can you reframe your work situation to think, is this an opportunity to look at some of the processes, some of the ways that I do things, some of the ways that I lead people? Can I use this as an opportunity to really kind of change my direction or add some value there in a different way?
Absolutely.
That's a definite one for reflection, isn't it? Definite one for reflection there. So I hope in terms of that little list, a lot of those aspects would apply to individuals as employees, as leaders. But we'll now move on to thinking a little bit more about the neuropsychology and what that experience is like, what's actually going on for you. So as you can see from this lovely picture here, when we're under stress, the idea is that it's a very basic mechanism that's going on in our bodies, our limbic system. When we perceive a threat, and it might be something small that triggers it, because the whole brain system is more based on what happened in evolutionary terms when we were running away from dinosaurs and saber-toothed tigers, etc. But what we've essentially got going on is that when we see something that threatens us, it triggers the blood flow to that part of our brain that actually is responsible for stress. So what you tend to notice for individuals is that increased heart rate, maybe a dry mouth, maybe people are quite fidgety, the blood pressure goes up, all of those challenging things. But at a sort of neurological level, the challenges that come with that mindset or that state of being are the blood flow moves away from that kind of our rational, higher level thinking brain. And what the challenges happen is that actually we're going to have a reduction in our mental focus. So the ability to think straight, the ability to put a sentence together might go a bit wonky. Our ability to plan, problem solve and remember is a little bit challenging as well. So I think the reason why I show you this is because actually, if you want to tune in and understand what's going on at a personal level, if you're anything like me, I like to understand why, the why behind things. So if I know that things aren't quite right, and a way to work out if you've moved into this kind of emotional state is to say, do I want to feel like this? And if the answer is no, then actually what we know is we call it a hijack. We've been hijacked. So we need to take some action. But that recognition and that self-awareness puts us into a position to, first of all, know that this is a normal experience. And what triggers that emotional reaction or that physiological reaction for me will be different to you and to the next person. But actually, if we can start to recognize when we're moving over to that side, then actually we're starting to be in a position where we can maybe detach or just start to think about what we can do about it. So with that in mind, shall we move on to some of the practical things for an employee, please, with the next slide? Okay, so we talked before from the leader point of view about that self-care. I heard a really nice saying. Somebody said the other day, like grandma says, you can't drink from an empty cup. And I think that really does apply to this, doesn't it? We need our cup to be full so that we can look after ourselves. And that idea of the normalization, I'm feeling uncertain, so are you, but we're in this together and it is going to fluctuate, and that's okay. And as a result of that, maybe we want to just adjust our mindset and think about things on a day-to-day basis. Again, the transition truth, same as before, there's going to be time, there's going to be emotion, it's going to affect everybody. We understand that. And that recognition piece, adding with the neurological experience of the, you can't think straight and all the rest of it, we can recognize here with overwhelm, if you've gone to the other extreme there, that you might be feeling that real kind of sense of defeat and not feeling great at all, everything's too much. And the burnout side of that coin as well is also that idea of you might want to be you might notice in yourself, or family members or colleagues might notice you starting to distance. And as before, acting quickly, if you notice that in a colleague, if you have that kind of relationship with them, you could really help them by gently sharing. If you've noticed something different, that kind of checking could be really helpful to people. And in terms of your own boundaries, maybe noting the hours that you're working, thinking about, the extent, and noticing if there's any patterns or if it's creeping and you are doing more and more and more. And again, as before, you can seek out from this point of view, if you do have that relationship with your line manager, hopefully you will do, having that conversation, approaching them so that you can talk about, can they support you, reaching out, because I think the key thing to say here is that the responsibility lies with both parties really, You know, hopefully you're going to have that relationship where you can share, or equally if somebody notices, that they can tell you. But if we both kind of need to be working on that continuum to really partner and come up with some effective solutions there. And the last bit again, you know, that acknowledging emotions. So if we just move to the next slide now, there's a little graph again that again can be used. So you can see here, you know, we've always talked about the impact of stress. And at the bottom end, you know, if we don't have enough stress, we know it's demotivating. We might be a bit lethargic and a bit, ugh, can't be bothered. I don't think there's many people at that end at the minute, but I don't know. And then obviously moving towards the centre, we've got that idea of the right amount of that healthy tension that keeps us motivated and engaged. And that's really where we want to spend most of our time. But the flip side of that is that when we are in that state, maybe we're overextended and we're doing too much and keeping those plates spinning for a prolonged period, as you might be facing now, some of the behaviours that you might start to see is that depletion of energy. Somebody might start feeling very, you know, fatigued and drained. And certainly in yourself, you know, if you've done too much or you kept going, sometimes it takes people a good couple of days, doesn't it, to kind of recharge those batteries. And I think what you can do with this model again, it opens up, you know, reflect at a personal level. Where am I? Am I in that green zone? Great, you know, let's see what I can do to stay there. But if you're noticing you are creeping up to the other side of it, it's far better to try and have a conversation and think about what you can do while while you're only just stepping into it. Because certainly the experience I had from an executive that I coached recently, he kind of put his emotions to one side and just felt like he was relatively new into a position, and actually kind of shelved all the feelings and just kept going and kept going and kept going through a bereavement, through managing a team, etc., etc., and made no space. There's some acknowledgement there about what that might look like, maybe. And actually, what that led to for him was taking some time out, because he said his body literally wouldn't function. Yeah. So again, thinking about, you know, that oxygen mask, because to him being a leader and supporting his team so important, but actually he couldn't, even if he wanted to, because he was so exhausted himself. So again, you know, that invitation to think about where you are and just use it as a guide. If you're creeping up there, what can you do? Okay, next slide, please. So this is one of my favourites. This is the good old circle of control. So it's a very simple model there. And the idea behind it is, in a moment of stress and pressure, just simply thinking about a circle and mapping out for yourself all of the things that are at this moment in your control, and putting the things in the wider circle that aren't in your control. So it might be, you know, the circumstances in which you're working, influencing factors as a result, or not working, absolutely, yeah. So all the things that you really don't have any control or influence over. And actually the idea with this is that if we are spending our energy and our focus is always on the things that are beyond our control, it's a very negative and draining state, because actually we're not very proactive. We can only react to some of these big events. So the idea with this model is that actually what you're trying to do is reframe, change your mindset a little bit, and focus, you know, ask yourself, and I do use this sometimes when there's a lot going on and I just think, you know, oh, can't see the wood for the trees. Stepping back and thinking, what's one small thing I can work on right now? And actually what you find is that moves you to a more, again, towards this kind of proactive mindset, gets you taking action, and you kind of feel like things are a little bit more doable. Again, with that, we talked about the boundaries already, managing your own boundaries. Hopefully you've got a line manager that's modeling the right way with boundaries. You might want to think about, you know, what boundaries would work for you. And we're not suggesting that people will know straight away. I think, you know, people might have to try a few different things out. You might be more productive in the morning and it might suit you to get up. Equally, you might be somebody that prefers to work in the evening. I certainly know people with small children that are doing hours in the evening, and that works quite well for them. So just kind of being flexible and trying things out is good. Getting into good habits. So one of the things that's really challenging is when you've got to make decisions about everything. So getting back to basics, you know, sleep, exercise, nutrition, hydration, just some really good positive habits that help you be your best self, really, and just keep going. And sitting alongside that, an idea of psychological flexibility. So it is a psychological term, but essentially that talks about 2 skills. And the first one is mindfulness. So, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about mindfulness? And I think we've all had a try at it in some way, shape or form. And I think we all have our own favourites, don't we? But the idea is that as a skill, it's basically like going to the gym. If you kind of train your brain in that way, you build it as a skill. And as part of that, what that means is that when you're faced with challenges or unexpected things that you really can't control, you're able to just kind of maybe tolerate them a little bit more by being present, by being maybe noticing how you're feeling. It certainly helps, with some of the graphs that we've looked at earlier. If you can really tune into your experience, you're in a good position to kind of notice and take action, rather than you notice at the end of it when everything's gotten too much for you. And that really helps. But coupled with the mindfulness is the other idea of values-based action. And again, there's a link in the handout that helps with this, but it's something that I'm very passionate about. It's the positive psychology side of things, really. You as an individual, what are you passionate about in the workplace? What is your workplace value? And what you can actually do is try and align your behaviour in support of your values, because actually behaving in this way, it gives us a way, like a code or a way of behaving. Yeah. And actually, if we're able to demonstrate in that way, it's certainly associated with feeling more positive. So, for example, for me, being a trusted colleague, that's very important to me in a workplace setting. So finding that opportunity to support other individuals or help other individuals really kind of makes my values come to life. So both of those give you things to focus on, rather than trying not to feel stressed. If you can kind of shift your focus towards something, actually you're occupying your mind with positive things, which tries to keep you on the right side of that kind of stress curve, really. Another thing around positive coping, we are so technologically bombarded, aren't we, these days? So limiting social media, being quite clear about the sources, because actually, if, as we know, the news has a negativity bias, and we're kind of, we're hit with crises all the time. And actually that in itself can trigger that threat perception. It's very stressful to read that kind of information all of the time. So if you're able to kind of, limit it, do you really need to see the news several times a day, or the latest Twitter feed? That's really a good idea, isn't it? And again, with that, checking your influences. We talked in a good way about who you go to get your information and who you trust. But equally, in a negative way, if you're influenced by somebody, if there's somebody that's really negative, then the chances are that's going to impact how you see things, how you feel. So maybe being selective.
But I've also noticed that, there's that concept of being in your own bubble. Whereas if you're only hearing certain things, it can create a certain amount of frustration because you don't understand why others don't.
Yeah.
And what you just can't see where they're coming from. So sometimes it's doing the opposite, going out and looking for information that doesn't support where you already are, because then it gives you, I've always found that if I understand, I always put it this way, if I can understand what the other side is thinking, then I'll feel better about what's happening. And that's probably partly my legal background and as a mediator, that if I can't understand where both people are coming from, I can't come to a solution. So if we feel, I always say, if the news is making me angry, it's probably because I'm not reading, either I'm reading too much of it or I'm not reading both sides of it, because I can't see where other sides are coming from. And that's been a lot of that going on lately, where if your bubbles can be really strong and give you a lot of fear and anxiety because they don't explain the other side or other views at all.
Yeah, so I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head there, that kind of evidence. So maybe questioning and trying to get that balanced perspective. So deepening understanding, absolutely, that balance and that evidence is the way to go, isn't it? I think if somebody's gotten to the point where their Twitter feed is just so negative, then we know that and you're feeling and it's triggering that emotion, then maybe it's time to kind of look to, who you reviewing on a Monday morning before you go to work.
I'll be honest, I
Also, I
haven't
think
been
the
on
other,
Twitter in years. I've not done that because I know that's how I'll dive down a
yeah,
hole. So yes, my Twitter feed for the business is handled by somebody else because I won't go there. That one's not a good environment for me.
totally. So, and it's great that you recognise that, isn't it? Because I think sometimes you can just, you've had a look at something and half an hour's gone by and you think, well, it's not a good use of your time anyway. So certainly, yeah, limiting that or being selective is definitely a good idea. I think the other side of this is kind of thinking as well about your positive experiences. So yes, we've not been through this set of circumstances before, but is there something about a change that you've experienced before? I know you said you've been through lots of changes, so maybe having that opportunity to reflect and thinking, was there something that helped me manage that change last time that I can draw upon or maybe try this time?
Well, I know one of the things I do is there was one period of my life where lots of really bad things happened in succession that I had no control over, literally no control over, and that feeling like everything was happening and I wasn't going to survive it, somehow I wasn't
Right.
going to get to the other end of it. And I look back at that now and go, if you can make it through that, you can make through a lot of things. And I've also had friends who've gone through so many things, and I think, you know what? They've been able to make it through. I will get through this eventually. But being willing to admit that I'm not okay right now, that was big for me. That was a big way for me to get out of where I was, is to be
Right.
able to
Yeah.
say, yeah, you know what? A lot is happening to me right now, and I need help because I just don't know how. And admitting that things aren't going right, because we always want to put on that, oh nope, everything's fine, everything's great, and admitting,
Sure.
no, everything's not okay right now, and I need help. And you know what? When I finally let go and did that, I got a lot of help. I really got the help I needed, and eventually came out the other side. So it really it really does make a difference when you can put things in perspective, and when you can believe in yourself that you can get to the other side, and believe that those people that you've decided to surround yourself with, that they will be okay with you if you don't, that you're in the
Mm.
right environment, work or personal, regardless, that if you've been mindful about the people you have around you, that you'll have the right people around you when you need the help, and they'll be there for you.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, isn't it, in terms of breaking down the stigma of
Mm,
sharing your experiences, actually being able to talk about it at a personal level, and what using that to help you in the future is brilliant. But actually,
yeah.
sometimes hearing a colleague's or a friend's story about what they did can really help to give you some ideas if you're feeling stuck as well. So absolutely encourage that, definitely. And having,
Mm,
having that time for reflection, I would certainly say, because we don't know, I've said it repeatedly as we've been chatting today, but because we've not experienced this before, building in time as you kind of change things or do things differently and just seeing how it's impacting you, noting that kind of, looking inwards, how do I feel? Am I feeling stressed? I know it's normal because things are unexpected, but sort of having that opportunity to check in is important, because
mm.
it's equipping you with that skill set to notice what's going on inside you. And I think that's something that I encourage everybody to do, absolutely. And building on that, I think, that idea of self-compassion,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of research out there that in its simplest form, being compassionate towards yourself gets you back into that effective mindset. It can reduce the stress. And it's certainly, I think, without a doubt, the number one thing that people struggle, because we all have that negative inner voice. Should do more, not good enough, whatever that voice tells us, we've all got one.
That
And I
imposter
think
syndrome, I think, is the
absolutely, yeah. So whatever that voice is, if we're able to label it and say it's, it's the radio or whatever it is, give it its name, that's helpful, because that then gives us some psychological distance. It's something else, it's not us. And we can start to get that distance by describing it like that. But I think
yeah.
the most useful technique that I've seen, and people through the coaching, people have talked about imagining what they would say to a colleague who was going through something similar.
Hmm.
And the kind of revelation that we would never talk to a colleague or a friend in that way. That inner voice would, destroy us, but actually when we're talking to someone else, it's a lot more constructive, isn't it? It's a lot more, have you thought about, could you try? you're doing a good job, and sort of like you said before, reconnecting with that learning if you've managed to go through something before and building on it. So one of the, you know, shorthand way if you are struggling is almost to imagine what you'd say to a friend, and then turn that experience around and say, right, can I take that advice myself?
Yeah.
Takes a bit of getting used to, I have to say, but I have, you know, I've seen some really positive outcomes, because I think what happens is you're retraining your thought process. So you
Yeah.
will need to practice some of these things. It won't, you know, they do require you to kind of keep doing it, keep doing it. But I think that's a really useful one. And there's a resource, Dr. Kirsten Neff. She's got some lovely practical ideas that you can just click on and have a little look at there that are great. The other side of it is if you're at work. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking another thing I think we've discussed before is one of my coping mechanisms that I've done before things happen, and they've helped me through. Is one of those things that happened to me was a car accident, a quite severe car accident. And when we were talking about meditation and mindfulness, I've been doing yoga for a long time, 20 odd years, and the idea of this finding calmness in a stressful situation is something that's not automatic. It's something we learned, and it's something I practiced for such a long time that it was automatic to me. It's not something I had to remember to do. I didn't have to remind myself that something really stressful, this car is coming at me and I can't get out of the way. I'm going to get hit. And to just, my brain immediately went slower. The opposite of what we normally would be, which is stressed out. It's almost like, you know, the drunk person who doesn't get as hurt when they fall down the stairs because they just don't know to get stressed. But it helped, because that was an accident where I was hit hard enough that my car rolled. And if I hadn't have been calm, and if I hadn't been relaxed, if I had been stock straight and stiff, I actually probably would have suffered a quite severe head injury, if not a terminal one. And as it was, I couldn't, well, I didn't walk away, but I was able to leave hospital later day. I wasn't seriously injured. I had concussion, was a moderate concussion was the worst I had. So the fact that it was something I did daily, that meditation, that idea that and doing it in the terms of the yoga, where it's a stressful, you know, putting yourself in that really stressful situation, but breathing through it and knowing that you will get to the other side of it, it creates an autonomic response in you eventually. So if we practice that every day, it will help with our emotional responses and our physical responses eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is obviously an extreme example of that experience. So pleased that you had that practice and you were able to go to that space as well. But I think, yeah, in a day-to-day basis, just that, as you say, that kind of noticing that acceptance and then moving towards all that reframing. I mean, your body obviously knew to do that anyway, but in a conscious mindset, maybe just kind of thinking, taking some of that learning away. Yeah, definitely. I'm building on that as well, the kind of gratitude side of things, because, you know, you might think we certainly see all these gratitude journals, don't we? And lots of people talk about it as a practice. And I certainly have to admit, I was a little bit skeptical until I kind of looked at what was going on behind it. But actually, in terms of a practice, you know, noting down those kind of 3 positive things that you are grateful for before you start work or at the end of the day, etc. Again, building on what you've just said, it's got a healing effect. And it is about activating the kind of scanning or the looking in the environment for positive experiences and positive things. So moving away from that propensity to just kind of, you know, be heightened and anxious all of the time. If we can shift our gaze or our perception for looking out for the good things, that's a much better place to be. And in terms of sort of the physiological benefits, gratitude as a practice is associated with having lots of that really kind of restorative deep sleep. It's, you know, low blood pressure, reduces inflammation. So as a physiological level, there's some really kind of advantages there. Psychologically speaking as well, reducing stress, anxiety, as we said, it rewires the brain. So it is a practice, again, with all of these things. The key bit is that you want to have built it into your day-to-day life anyway. If you suddenly start thinking that an afternoon of, you know, quick mindfulness on an app activity is going to fix everything, then sadly it won't. But just as we would go and build muscles in the gym, you know, we want people to be kind of building those practices in day to day, because that will give you that resilience and help you feel well to manage some of these unexpected experiences that you might be having. And the last aspect of it is the social side of it. You know, if you're seeking out an opportunity to be grateful to somebody, then actually it builds relationships. So if we are slightly more isolated in our digital world, actually if you're reaching out to thank somebody and to communicate with somebody in that way, you know, we need better relationships. So deepening levels of empathy would be really well received, I think, right now. Some of the tools that you can try as well with the gratitude, certainly, you know, there's the journaling, there's a bit about looking in the mirror in the morning, saying 5 things that you appreciate in yourself, paying yourself compliments. I mean, you know, why not? Certainly something to try.
I know some people are like, oh, that's just silly, and they feel embarrassed doing it. It's like, get over yourself. It's
Yeah,
yourself. It's a mirror. It's surprisingly effective, and it doesn't make you arrogant or anything. It does the opposite. It makes it kicks you out of that negative self-image and the negative self-thought.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's such a, I don't want to be, you know, but it is a British thing. A lot of the British people that I've noticed are so uncomfortable with that kind, yes, a little bit of the going on, but they're so uncomfortable. They're worried about being perceived as arrogant.
Yeah.
And I think the way to get around that, you talked about it before, is looking for the evidence. You know, it's actually, if you can kind of compliment yourself on something that you've done that is positive, that you've achieved, and it's, you know, somebody else could notice it and it's evidence-based rather than you look gorgeous this morning or whatever, then actually that can keep you on the other side. If you want to say that, go for it. You can say that as well. But I think, you know, looking for the evidence and just keeping it practical, you know, if you've supported a colleague, if you've done a good job, a recognition of that, why not? I think, you know, if we know that deep down that's going to support your mental health, then I think we should all be trying to find those opportunities for those little wins as we just manage our day-to-day experience as well. And the last one, increasing self-knowledge there. So again, on that positive psychology frame of mind, thinking about your strengths. I don't know, have you ever done a strength profile before? Have you ever sat down and done one?
Yes, I've done it. I've done
so
several.
You know your strengths. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you have the opportunity to use your strengths day to day?
Not every day, but I do recognize what they are and try and focus on those, because of, unfortunately, when you run a business, you don't always just get to do the stuff you're good at. You sometimes have to focus on the things you're not so good at. But knowing what I am good at and actually taking joy in doing those things is important. When I get the chance to just do those things I love to do, I really pay attention to the fact that I get to do that today, and I'm really happy that I get to do that today.
Yeah, and I think that's great, isn't it? That, you know, mindful moments of being able to use your strengths, often associated with that, you know, when we kind of lose track of time, isn't it? And all those great things where we're so engrossed in something positive. There is again, in the handout, there is a link to a free assessment that you can do. So if you don't know and you're curious, you could spend a little bit of time in a coffee break and just look at what your signature strengths are. But the research around that is, you know, if you can find opportunities for you to use your strengths at least some of the time, then that's associated with feeling well and, you know, being in a good space. So why not do that, hey?
Yeah.
And then the final one on this list. So the peer support idea. So Mind has got as a resource on the website some suggestions about how you might want to do it formally within a workplace. But equally, there's that idea of, you know, as an individual, can you reach out? Can you have a virtual coffee break with a colleague just to have some conversation, maybe not about work, but just to kind of keep that check-in? Because actually we know that social isolation actually makes us feel worse. We feel better when we're having shared experiences because, you know, we are sort of pack animals, if you will. We are used to being socially connected to each other. So seeking out those opportunities to just kind of check in with people and just share and just be a little bit social can really help you to manage that. Okay, so some thoughts there on, I'm hoping that you've got some ideas that you might like to try from this.
Hopefully, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll move on now to the neurodiversity, if we can, onto the next slide.
So important. I think if you can start out, because I'm very familiar with neurodiversity. I have have some neurodiverse issues. I'm not neurotypical. I'm neurodiverse. I have a lot of people around me, so that, but it's not a one thing. So a lot of people think either they don't know what neurodiversity is, or they think it's one specific thing. So can you tell us a bit about
Yeah.
what that is?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, to begin with, neurodiversity as a term, it's an umbrella term, and it essentially means that individuals may have areas of strength or areas of weakness that are slightly more exaggerated than in comparison to your general population. So, for example, somebody with a dyslexic profile might find being organised, time management, sort of diary planning, and conversations where there's lots of people talking, they might find that more challenging than a neurotypical person. But actually, conversely, individuals who have a neurodiverse profile often have what we like to call super strengths that are actually exaggerated in comparison to your sort of typical neurotypical people. So in other words, often, certainly again, if we use the dyslexic profile, those individuals are often extremely creative, really good at thinking outside of the box, and are individuals that are, sometimes have elevated communication skills as well, sort of really good verbally, often have a great memory and think visually. So what I suppose the invitation there is, if you are somebody that has traits like that, it's about finding the opportunity again to use those strengths. I read a piece of research this morning on Harvard Business Review by the individual Nancy Doyle, who is a CEO who actually has ADHD herself, and she was talking about actually within COVID-19 circumstances, you know, this increased pressure. She was talking about how her laser focus and her pressure, her ability to deal in pressured environments, the ADHD allows her to manage much better in comparison to some of her neurotypical colleagues. Actually, that's when she feels like she's at her most able, really. So I think sometimes it's about understanding, rather than moving it away at a medical model where we're seeing people as having deficits. Yes, individuals might need adjustments, but actually on the flip side of that, some of these super strengths can actually really help individuals, for example, with a dyslexic profile again, problem solving. You know, if you're needing something done differently, a person with a dyslexic profile could actually probably come up with something really unique and helpful. So it's again looking at how you can harness those strengths in a different working environment, really.
Absolutely, and I think that's been my experience with the neurodiversity I have, which I didn't know, I didn't recognize, and it wasn't a normally tested thing when I was younger, or in the States and where I lived. So I wasn't aware of what was going on in my brain until I was in my early 20s, and by then I had been trying to learn how to cope around those without knowing that was what I was coping around. I just said, well, I'm just not very good at that. I'm just not very good at this. So I will do something that I am good at and sink into that. But I think if we do understand that since we're getting better at identifying neurodiversity and seeing it more as a different rather than a deficit, the medical perspective tends to think in terms of deficit, whereas in the real world, it actually can be benefit if you're in the right environment. That if we've got those diagnoses, one of those things we've got to do is what you're saying, these work from home things, the strategies, understanding, recognizing when are you doing better, and don't expect it to be the same as other people. I think we're hearing a lot of people who are on spectrum who are actually really enjoying more the work from home environment, because an office-based environment can be very stressful for them if they don't know, you know, if there's a lot more people talking or movement, or if there's an open office scenario, that can be very stressful. Whereas oftentimes a work from home environment in a darker room with the small dark rooms work sometimes really well for people on the spectrum, as opposed to someone who's the opposite of the spectrum, which is me, which needs big, bright, loud, noisy. So
absolutely,
those things, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, once you're aware, I certainly like to come at it from a strengths-based model. The clinical model can be, you know, we're not all looking for just the flaws. We want to use people's superpowers, and horses for courses, there are opportunities where if you can align the job that you're doing with part of what your strength is, then I think that's a really good match, isn't it? And I think one of the things to say in terms of individuals that are neurodiverse, obviously if your brain thinks differently or has a different way of processing, if you will, then actually, as you said, some people find workarounds. And certainly when they have an adult diagnosis, they have found, you know, the individuals that I've worked with have found some excellent workarounds and been really, really successful. But all of that requires a lot of energy and can be quite draining and tiring. So stress definitely has a big impact on individuals that are neurodiverse, because if you're somebody that's not particularly able to plan or manage time effectively, if you find that slightly more challenging, if you add that stress component in there, it's going to be even more difficult. So we've got some coping strategies here. One of the things to say about decision fatigue, you know, we talk about so many decisions, what to eat, where to work, what we're doing, and reducing the level of decisions that you need to make is useful for everybody actually, but particularly so for someone who's neurodiverse. So for example, Barack Obama wore the same clothes every day, and you might think, you know, why would somebody do that? But just not having to use your brain power, your battery power on making a different decision can be really, really helpful. It's just narrowing down and saving that energy for the big decisions that you need to make it on that particular day. And again, to manage the stress. So as we, you know, again, this is suitable for every employee, but particularly for those neurodiverse, having a routine coming in before you start work, and maybe having, you know, lots of apps on mindfulness and things like that, but even just sitting in your chair and taking some deep breaths, maybe doing a body scan, that kind of thing can help you to really get into the right mindset for concentrating or organizing or whatever it is that you've got to do. And building into that as well, the idea of one task at a time. You know, we're all trying to multitask, and we know that your attention, you know, a piece of research that I read, it talked about, you know, it's almost like a drunk driving a car. Your level of ability to focus diminishes to such a point that, you know, you might get several tasks done, but are they going to be correct? If you're making important decisions, you know, you run the risk of, have you double checked that before you send it off? So we also know that working in that way is very stressful. So again, you know, maybe just dedicating a set amount of time and just allowing yourself to focus on that task only. One of the most interesting things that I heard was in relation to technology. So even having, you know, an iPhone or a phone on your desk doesn't have to be on, doesn't have to be doing anything. It actually can diminish your ability to focus and concentrate, because there's that anticipation there of, if you've got a message, is it going to light up? So, you know, the recommendation is sometimes just putting it all away and just focusing on that task. Scheduling tasks. So we talked a little bit about that earlier. And is there a particular time of the day that works?
Yeah. No, I never know from day to day, so that wasn't me. But I was saying, actually, the scheduling task thing goes back to the decision fatigue and the mindset and those things, because I've noticed for me that, especially if I'm struggling to get things done, if you have that task list, people now are thinking, oh, there's these technologies that can you can go online and get this thing that'll do tasks and schedules. I'm like, no, I just see the red light blinking at me, and that makes me more stressed. So what I've done is do a daily written calendar of, this is what I'm going to do at this time, this time, this time, and this time. And if I don't get it done in that time, it's okay. I'm going to throw that away, and it's going to go away tomorrow. It means I'm just focusing on those. I don't have to, and I do it the day before, so I don't have to decide that day what to do next. Even if, and it's fine if that schedule is disrupted, but at least I don't have to choose which task I'm going to do next, because that decision has already been made for me by myself. But I'm also not going to have some computer thing yelling at me at the end of the day because I didn't get it done.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, people tend to have loads of different apps, and then the problem becomes, which one do you focus on? But I'm absolutely with you. I enjoy, there's something I think as part of my daily routine, writing down what I'm doing and having it written. And there's certainly a joy for me in crossing them off when I've done those things as well. Fitting with that as well, that kind of idea about scheduling, prioritization. So, you know, some people are more energetic in the morning and in the evening. We vary massively. So if you have that flexibility, I know neurodiverse individuals tend to be particularly attuned to that time of day. And it's a lot of the work that I do when I'm coaching individuals, just helping them to realize what works best for them. So you can actually do simple things like mapping out how energetic or what your energy level is out of 10 over the course of a day. And, you know, if you do that over a number of days, you might notice that some days, you know, you're a morning person, you're an afternoon person. So you can actually do that. But the recommendation would always be to kind of choose those meaty, challenging tasks for when you're feeling quite energetic and energized, and maybe leave yourself some of the lighter tasks if you can for maybe the afternoon, or, you know, the time that you're not quite at your peak. But again, we've talked about this, the taking regular breaks. You know, we can't maintain concentration solidly. Some research suggests that actually for some people it can be as little as 25 minutes. So you know, you can set yourself a timer, the Pomodoro method, which essentially means little tomato, because apparently that's what the timer was, that the individual had, a nice little tomato. But actually what you can do is you can break your tasks up using that, you know, in 25 minutes, and give yourself a 5-minute break, maybe do some stretches before you come back to it. And actually, having tried that myself, what I notice with that is that often you get so into the task, you know, you find that time's starting to flow and you're getting really into it. And actually you don't want to finish when that you know, you've got that 5-minute break. So it can actually create motivation for you as well. It gets you really into it. You've already talked about the managing distractions. Yeah, absolutely. You know, some people like silence, other people like music. There's a whole host of apps that kind of provide white noise if that's what you need to have, that kind of background distraction. So again, it's thinking,
yeah, not everyone's going to be the same. What works best for one is not going to work the best for others.
Yeah,
I just want to take
at home.
Yeah, really quick side note here is because we are getting close to the end, I do want to ask people, if those that are still in with us, if you have questions, please start typing them in now, so that I know that I make sure I keep enough time at the end for us to answer those. I just wanted to remind people that there is the opportunity to ask questions, so please do that, and we will get to those questions before we wrap up. Okay,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so just talking about that idea of taking breaks and managing distractions. Now, you know, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be distracted when we're focusing. And let's be honest, for those that are working at home and there's little people and cats and dogs, I've seen cats walk across laptops and all the rest of it. We need to kind of be realistic, you know, as much as possible, as within your control. I think we've all seen other people be distracted. We've all seen things, and, you know, if we think about that circle of control, there is a limit to how much you can control. You might put a note on your door saying do not disturb, but again, we want to manage what we can, but without being rigid and absolute, because I think that will create stress in itself. So just being a bit flexible there. And the other one, another method that I really enjoy using, that dump pad. So when you're in the zone and you're really focusing, often, and I think that happens with mindfulness as well, often when you're trying to relax and let go, your mind is just so full of thoughts. So that idea of keeping, you know, a dump pad to hand, that if you're having this moment of focus, I call it a power hour when I do it, but just jotting down anything that comes to mind, so that you know you don't need to worry about forgetting it. It's on the list and you can come back to it later on.
Okay.
And again, using strength.
I saw dump pad first, and I just thought dog, you know, like the wee pad. So it's not anything to do with training a dog.
No, that might be a different type of session. It's literally to take the things out of your head and dump them on a piece of paper, so you don't need to worry about them. So definitely one if you're that kind of person that has a lot of thoughts as soon as you need to focus on something else. And again, the final one there is using strengths. So again, you know, we've all got strengths. Sometimes part of the coaching process when I engage with individuals is, you know, you say, well, what are your strengths? I don't know. Well, let's find them. Everybody's got strengths, and I think, you know, ask other people. Sometimes people can tell you what you're good at, you might not have noticed. So finding that opportunity to use those strengths and build on them to help you is really important. On the flip side of that, when we talk about working from home, a really useful sort of model here that you can use, just some questions to help you set up your working environment, but it could be used for a whole host of different reasons. Thinking about when a time has gone well. So tuning in, can you recreate that set of conditions to support you in the role or in the time that you're working? So in other words, as we've already said, the environment. Are you in the right space, the right equipment, etc.? Can you recreate the light, fresh air? We know we need lots of fresh air to boost our concentration, that kind of thing. Behavior, so tuning in, you know, what is it that you do when you're working well? Are you sat still? Do you have all the right equipment to hand? Have you really kind of set up your environment to support yourself? Are you focused? And tuning in and almost visualizing what that looks like is really helpful. Skills, again, what are you good at? What are the strengths? How can you make sure you have an opportunity to deploy them in that moment? Values and beliefs we talked about earlier. So, you know, what is important to you in that moment when you're doing this piece of work? How do you want it to go? Do you want to be seen as a professional colleague, etc., etc.? And finishing off with identity. And the idea is, how do you want to be seen? How do you want other people to perceive you? Because often if we're able to create that vision, if you will, of what that looks like, subconsciously we can often align our behavior and match up. So if you're really clear about what good looks like, you can kind of tune into it before you start your working day.
Good.
And there we go.
Excellent so much. We do have a couple of questions coming in. So
Lovely.
I'll start with the first one, which good one. It says, thank you for a great session so far. Thank you very much for that. It seems that many people are reluctant to return to work as we're lifting lockdown. Do you think this is partly due to people preferring work from home compared to sometimes long days in the office, toxic, high stress office workplace environments?
I mean, what I would say is that I think it's a very personal experience. Some individuals, you know, as we've said earlier, are actually working more outside of work. So I think in general, the move towards flexible working has worked well for individuals that really didn't need to physically be in the office to do the work. A lot of individuals that I've spoken to, particularly in the coaching, are missing a little bit of the social interaction, but actually have been quite proactive in having those coffee breaks, those virtual coffee breaks. When you move out into a virtual environment, the skill sets that you need to be effective as a team member and as a leader are actually slightly different than if we were working on a face-to-face basis. So I think there's going to be a period of adjustment. Some positive things that sort of have come out of working in that way and communicating in that way, in terms of people on group exercises, women have actually been more willing to come forward. So there might be some gender differences in terms of not all being in the same group around the same table. There's some suggestions that that might be more beneficial to certain groups. But I would say it's a personal experience largely. And I think that flexibility around making it work for that individual is also important. I think about that communication piece and just spending that time working out what works for individual teams. Not being too rigid, I think, would stand people in good stead there.
I think we're also seeing stress from people who are working not in an office setting per se, but maybe in a retail setting where they're stressed about more people coming in. They may be having to work. I am going into a store about a month ago and thanking the people for being there, and because I wanted to make sure they understood that I was grateful for them so that I could buy the supplies, and the person said, I don't have a choice. That the response told me a lot when they said, I don't have a choice. I went, okay, you would prefer not to be here because this is it's scary for them, but they don't have a choice. They have to work. They have to be doing this. So I think there is also a level of stress around that. It's one of the reasons I'm always wearing a mask when I go out now, even though not everyone does. People might be afraid of it. It's like I'm doing this because I know that there are people out there who are afraid of the people coming into the stores. And I want to at least show them that I'm going to respect that about their sacrifices, as it were, to be there and to be at work. I think we have time for one more question, which was, do you have a recommendation for a resource if my employer hasn't been very responsive to my needs from a mental health standpoint? Do you have a resource or I can go to provide that push to my employer?
So in terms of looking at where you stand, ACAS is a very useful website to start off with and can give telephone support and have a conversation. In terms of access to work as well, it's worth having a look on there because sometimes they do accept individual referrals. Often the recommendation is that you've had that conversation in the first instance to talk about maybe support or reasonable adjustment, but I'm hearing there that might not be something that you're finding easy. So my recommendation would be to have a look at ACAS and have a look in relation to the access to work, just to find out a little bit more, because there will be individuals there that you could speak to that will give you some onward support there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think we have a couple of slides with some showing some of the additional resources. These are some of the references that were used throughout. So if you want to follow up on those are excellent. And then the next slide, which are links to support. And again, these are all available, downloadable on the handout, which is really great. This will also be available as on demand. It will be available on the Anson Evaluate website and social medias, and I believe on Serenity's. Serenity will be having it available as soon as we have it, the final recording finished, which would be fantastic. And we are very happy for this to be spread to as many people as possible, because I think it's an incredibly important topic. So I think there's some contact details as well on the next slide. I think, yep, there we go. Those are two people who work at Serenity who you can contact, and that contact information is also on the handout. Serenity, I'll have to say, I'll give you a push for you guys, because they're an amazing organization. We've received help from you as a business, and I know many people who have benefited from the assistance of people from Serenity. They're outstanding. Also, I'm being reminded, if you have any questions, or if you have any other topics you would like us to cover in this, or follow-up questions that we weren't able to answer, or if you just didn't have the time to, they can email us at events@ansonevaluate.com. That's events@ansonevaluate.com. And you can receive a full copy of the exact slides for today. So if you didn't have everything in the handout and you want that, you can have those slides as well. Just give us a shout there. And also, if you want to sign up for notification of upcoming webinars for us. So again, thank you very much for attending and on this wonderful sunny day. So I will let you go and go out, but thank you so much, Paula, for your talk today, because I think it's helped me. So I hope it's helped our attendants as well. So thank you very much, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.